Today I'm at Kelton House with
Priscilla Hewitson
and
James Mason.
and James Mason and Priscilla.
Jim and Priscilla.
How long have you been doing period time music?
We are brother and sister, and we grew up in our living room with our parents playing instruments as we did in those days.
And what caused you to do this type of music?
Well, we
There was no television.
Well, yeah, back during
Or
those days,
computers.
of course, before any kinds of entertainments. But we're both affiliated with the Ohio Historical Society, and since the village is a Civil War site, of course, we became very interested in the music that was appropriate for that particular setting.
How many other events have you done like this?
Oh my goodness, lots and lots and lots.
Okay.
We've done many concerts of Civil War music.
Do you remember doing a wedding in Ohio Village?
Yes, absolutely. Jim and I played that wedding right outside of the village square by the gazebo, and it was delightful fun.
Well, I am Howard Carter from the 5th United States Color Troop. I got to film that event. That was one of my first events, and I want to thank you, and I want you to keep hope alive, and I am thankful that you are allowing me an opportunity to sing with you this day.
Absolutely, and we're looking forward to that.
All right, thank you.
That'll be fun.
Thank you very much.
This war has been going on for some time now. And many people still in this country can't understand how we've gotten to this point. North versus South, brother fighting against brother. But well before the guns of Fort Sumter, we knew, we felt this war coming along. You see, way back in 1850, when they started that fugitive slave law, the wind of this war started blowing in. Especially when many people in the North refused to abide by that law. And then this issue of slavery began to infect and affect every single part of this country, North and South, and every area of our government, from the judicial branch to the legislative branch, even to the executive branch. In one particular state, there was an old man who was a slave, and most of his life, he grew up as a slave, he was a slave most of his life, but for these last few months of his life, he had been living in a northern state, a supposedly free state. And so because he was living in a free state, he thought to himself, well, why am I a slave? I should be free. And so he sued for his freedom. And his court case went all the way up to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court. And the Judge Taney, who gave the majority opinion of this decision by the Supreme Court, he said to, the man's name was Dred Scott. And he said to him, he said, you have no rights whatsoever that any white man has to respect. You were born a slave and you will always be a slave. And he was sent back to slavery. But see, many people in the North had a problem with this because it was the Supreme Court's job to interpret the Constitution of the United States. And nowhere in the Constitution did it say anything like that. And it seemed as if these Southern judges were twisting the law and even the Constitution just for their own way of life. And then it even began to affect the legislative branch, our lawmaking area of government. And one particular senator was making a speech. His name was Charles Sumner. And he was speaking to Congress about how he thought that slavery was bad for the country. And in the middle of his speech, there was a Southern senator there who ran up on him with a cane and began to beat him with the cane till blood poured out all in the halls of Congress. Now, of course, these men are supposed to be upstanding, are men who represent us. They're supposed to be men of character, men of integrity, men of honesty, and a fight broke out all over this issue of slavery. And then even, yes, in the highest office of the land, the president had to deal with this issue of slavery. And there was one point of time in the 1850s where you see we have these new territories who were becoming states. And so the question that came up was whether or not these new states would be slave states or free states. And so the territory of Kansas came up to be a state. And of course the question went to the president. And of course the president, as many other politicians, didn't really want to deal with this sensitive, controversial issue. So he said, well, I'm not going to make that decision. Let the people of the territory of Kansas decide whether or not they want to be a free state or a slave state. And so he dropped the issue and tried to put it into the hands of the people. But see, then there were people from Texas and Alabama and Georgia who packed up their bags and moved to Kansas so they could vote to make it a slave state. And then there were also people from Ohio and Pennsylvania and New York who packed up their bags and moved to Kansas so they could vote to make it a free state. And when those people got together, fights broke out. Riots broke out on the street, and a small war erupted in the territory of Kansas all over this issue of slavery. Then right here in Ohio, there was a young lady who had been spending some time with a man who lived in Ripley, Ohio, and he had been doing some illegal activity. He had been helping slaves come across the Ohio River, and he began to tell her some of the stories that he heard from these people who were escaping slavery. From these stories, she realized, and she believed to herself, that many people didn't really understand how evil and how inhumane this institution really is. And so she thought that she would try to help people know what slavery is all about by writing a book. And so she wrote this book. And the book was called Uncle Tom's Cabin. The young lady, her name was Harriet Beecher Stowe. And almost immediately her book became a bestseller. It sold all across the North and it sold all across the South. And the people in the South were appalled. They said, well, who is this woman? She doesn't know about our way of life. She doesn't live down here. How can she talk about what slavery is all about? And they banned the book in the South, but it was too late. Too many people had already read it. And then there was another Ohioan. You see, in 1859, he had come to a point where he had believed he had done everything he could do to end slavery. He preached against it. He taught against it. He even took some guys with him and went over to Kansas during that time when they were voting whether to make Kansas a free state or a slave state. And he took them with some guns when he went down there. And still, it seemed that slavery would persist. And so he believed he needed to do something drastic, something radical. And so he grabbed a group of men, and they went down into a place called Harper's Ferry. And they broke into the armory, and he grabbed all the guns. And see, his plan was to get all of the guns and to take them out to the slaves and to help them to rise up and fight for their own freedom. But when they came out the army, they were surrounded by the authorities. They all ran. They all were caught. And when, of course, they were caught, they were hung. But when they got to this man who had organized all this, his name was John Brown. And they said, what were you thinking? You should have known that this would fail. Why would you come down and do something like this? And John Brown was not ashamed of what he had done. John Brown said that he believed that slavery was wrong, it was evil, it should end immediately, and that if he had the chance to do what he did, he would do it again. And so they hung John Brown. But then there were some people in the North who sympathized with John Brown. He was a man who was very passionate about what he believed in. He was willing to give his life for his passion, what he believed in. And so many people sympathized with him. And then there were some people who actually praised John Brown for what he did. And some people went as far as writing songs about John Brown. And people in the South were poor. They said, how can you praise this man? How can you write songs about this man? He came down to murder us, to kill our men, our women, our children. And you write songs about this man? And so in 1859, going into 1860, everybody in the South thought that everybody in the North hated them. Everybody in the North thought that everybody in the South were were just crazy over this issue of slavery. And in the middle of all of this tension, all of this controversy, comes the election. 6 months. Elected president in 1860, right? Somebody get out his name. Abraham Lincoln, that's right. And Abraham Lincoln was a part of the new Republican Party. And of course, the new Republican Party didn't necessarily believe that slavery was morally wrong, but they thought it was bad. This is the very fact that all of the wealth that was driven from these slaves for working for free without pay, all of that wealth just went into the hands of those who owned slaves. Now, so they thought the slave labor system was just bad business, and they believed in it. Were part of the United States, the Union, and so he and his troops were trespassing, and so they needed to leave immediately. Of course, this made you say, "Well, what do you mean we're trespassing? What do you mean you're not a part of the Union?" Yes, you are a part of the Union. And who are you to give us the order to leave? You are not our commander-in-chief. So no, we're going to stay right here. And so, well, if you stay right here, we're going to open fire. Of course, he stayed there, and of course, they opened fire, and they bombarded Fort Sumter with cannon fire, with musket fire, and tell that general, that major, had no choice but to retreat back to Washington City. When that time came, President Lincoln declared war against those states that had seceded from the Union. And he called for troops all across the North. He said, "Come together, let's bring our country back together again. Our brother has gone astray. I need men who will help fight to bring our country back together again so that we can be one union, so that our brother who has gone astray will bring him back into the fold." And of course, the men ran and rallied to join to President Lincoln and help fight to bring their country back together. And then there were also many black men in the North who ran to join the Union Army, but they had different reasons than everybody else who was joining the Union Army. You see, because this war was a war against all slave states, they thought that this was had to be the prime opportunity to end slavery. You see, in 1860, there were 4 million slaves living in the South, all of African descent. Many of them, their family members, people they knew, their descendants were slaves, and they wanted it to end. And they wanted to fight for the freedom of those 4 million slaves. And they had some other reasons. You see, even though many of them had come from states like here in Ohio and New York and Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, they still weren't quite treated like everybody else. No, they weren't slaves, and no, they weren't living in a slave state, but many of them couldn't send their children to public schools. Many of them weren't allowed to vote. Many of them weren't allowed to obtain public office and become a mayor or a governor. So they believed that if they fought for President Lincoln, that they would prove to the president and to the rest of the country that they deserve full citizenship rights. They should be treated like every other citizen. They believe that since they died in this country, they worked in this country, they bled in this country, they paid taxes in this country, that they should get all of the rights that every citizen should get. And they had yet another reason. They were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for citizenship. And even though they were men, there were still people that somehow believed that because of the color of their skin, that they weren't as equal as all of the other men, that somehow they were inferior. inferior. And so they wanted to get out in the battlefield and prove that they were just as equal as every other man that would be fighting in this war. So they were fighting for the freedom of 4 million slaves. They were fighting for their own citizenship and for the citizenship, the full citizenship rights for their descendants and the people that will come after them. And they were fighting for equality. Prove that they were just as equal. So they came, they went to sign and join the Union Army when President Lincoln called for troops. But when they came to sign their name, they were told no. They weren't allowed to join the Union. President Lincoln himself said, no, I don't want you all to fight. Because I know that you all are fighting to free slaves and to end slavery. And that's not what I want to do. I want to bring this country back together again with or without slavery. So you all going back home. We'll deal with this slavery at another time. This will be over with in just a few months. You all going back home. We'll take care of this. Of course, these men didn't give up now. We begin to sign petitions and write letters to our congressmen and to President Lincoln, asking him to turn this war into a war against slavery, asking him to allow a black man to help him fight and win this war. But of course, they didn't pay our petitions and our letters no mind. Then there was a few months went by. Then a year went by. Then 2 years went by. And day after day after day, thousands upon thousands of white men were dying in this war. And President Lincoln decided that he was going to have to do something about this issue of slavery because it was tearing his country apart. So, in September of 1862, after a particular battle, the Battle of Antietam, a very bloody battle in which both sides had extreme casualties, but a battle in which the Union was the victor. And after this particular victory, Abraham Lincoln declared that if the Confederacy did not surrender by January 1st of 1863, he was going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation and free all of the slaves who lived in those states that had seceded from the Union. And for the first time, no other president had ever made such a sweeping statement about the issue of slavery. No other president. And now that this man had put himself out there, he had stepped out, he could not turn away. He could not turn back what he said. He could not undo what he said. And you see, many of us, I came from Cincinnati, and there were many of us, when we heard this preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, we were excited and we celebrated because we knew that the Confederacy wasn't going to listen to anything Abe Lincoln had to say. They had their own president. You all know him, not to yell his name out too, right? Jefferson Davis, right? So they weren't going to listen to anything President Lincoln had to say. So we waited and waited with agency, with urgency. We believed and we knew finally a change was about to come. And on December 31st of 1862, we gathered in our halls and in churches and even out on the streets. And we would sing songs and we would dance and we would praise God. We would celebrate and we would read the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, waiting for midnight. And midnight came. And during the day, January 1st of 1863, with a steady hand, Abe Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And it stated that all slaves who lived in those states that had seceded from the Union would now henceforth forever be free. But in order for that to happen, that meant the Union had to go down into that territory and free those slaves, or in essence, the Union had to win the war. So, at the end of this emancipation, Abe Lincoln added a clause that finally gave black men the right to fight in the Union Army. And those same men who were told no, those same men who were turned back and were told that we don't need you, they came back to join the Union Army. Some men came with just rags on their backs. Some of them had been former slaves. but they proudly put on the colors of the Union Army. Some men had businesses, and homes, and even families that they left to join the Union Army. Some of these men had left this country altogether and went to live in Canada. But when they heard that Abe Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation and was allowing black soldiers to fight, they came back into the country so they can join the Union Army. And President Lincoln wanted to make sure that these men had every opportunity to be good soldiers. So he only ordered the best of the officers that he could find, the best officers he could find, to train these men. And many of these officers, they were very, very upset with this assignment. They said, well, why do you have us training them? We should be on the front lines of battle. Why are we spending our time or wasting our time with men who may not even get a chance to fight? But because he was the commander-in-chief, they followed their orders. And they began to train these black men. And almost immediately they saw how quickly they learned how to march, how quickly they learned how to use their muskets. And they saw immediately how these men were many times quicker, faster, stronger than the white soldiers who were fighting. Why? Because their motivation was different. They were fighting for their own freedom, for their own citizenship. They were fighting to prove something to the world. So after their training, officer sent word to President Lincoln. He said, all right, now we just spend time with the train these men, send us out to battle, let's go. President Lincoln said, not quite sure. You see, every situation, he had been receiving criticism from all over the North. They begin to write editorials in the newspapers. What did our president do? Oh, he's going to embarrass us around the whole world. These men won't fight. They're going to go out into the battlefield and turn into animals. And they won't listen to the orders of their officers. That's what they said about us. That we would turn into animals. That we wouldn't listen to the orders of our officers. And so when the time came for us to fight, we just found ourselves began to creep into the camps. And while these rumors were creeping into the camp that we were only going to be used for manual labor, we also got the rumor, well, not the rumor, but when we got our paycheck. You see, these men, we signed up believing that we would get the same amount of pay that white soldiers were getting paid. $13 a month. Now, I know $13 a month is not a lot of money, but these men were the breadwinners of their family, and so most of the time that money was sent back home. Black soldiers, when they got their paycheck, they were only paid $10 a month and had to pay $3 for their food. So they were only able to send home $7 a month. So everything that looked bad began to look gray and dismal. I had not myself joined the army yet, but we were waiting in Cincinnati. We were waiting to hear. We would read the newspapers just to see what these troops were doing, and we began to hear some of the rumors ourselves, and we ourselves wanted to go out and fight. And I had friends who went and joined the 1st Regiments raised in the north of Massachusetts, 54th, and we began to hear some word back from them, but we were waiting until they would raise a regiment here in Ohio. It hadn't happened yet. But eventually, I guess, some of these officers began to write letters to President Lincoln. And they began to tell President Lincoln, I said, listen, we spent time with these men. We've trained these men, and they can be used to be a single arm to help you win and turn the tide of this war. President Lincoln listened. And he finally allowed the black soldiers reading the newspapers about these first battles, and one of the first battles was the Battle of Fortress. And I will never forget about the battle. But in the Battle of Fortress, they had to attack the enemy, who was about 100 yards away. To the left of them was impossible terrain, to the right of them was a river, and on that river were Confederate naval ships. And almost immediately, when they began to attack the enemy, they were bombarded with cannon fire from the fort and from the naval ships, cannon fire and musket fire. And when you are bombarded with so much firepower, you have no choice but to retreat back back. But these men refused to retreat back. Many of them would get shot, they would get hurt, but they would continue to press on and rally forward. And many times these men would be shot, and you know, when you're shot, you're taken back to the camp, and they try to pull the bullet out your leg and the bullet out your arm, and they bandage up your arm and leg, and then, of course, that's where you're staying because you're wounded. But there were men who were shot in the leg, taken back to camp. They would pull the bullet out their leg, they would wrap up their leg with the bandages, and they would hop up and grab their gun and try to head back out on the battlefield. And officers would say, man, what are you doing? Listen, you're hurt, you're wounded, you don't have to go back out there. And these men would say, no, we gotta win, we gotta fight, we gotta keep going. And you see, because this was one of the first battles that black men were fighting in, there were reporters all around the battlefield. And they were writing down what they saw. And they wrote down and sent reports to their newspapers up north how these men refused to retreat, how these men refused to give up, how they would go back out into the battlefield even while wounded. Also in this battle of Port Hudson, you see, every regiment has what's called a flag bearer. The flag bearer's job is to hold up the regimental flag. Now this, of course, is not a regimental flag. A regimental flag is very unique to every regiment. This is just an American flag, but a regimental flag is the pride of the regiment. It represents the character, the integrity, virtue of that particular regiment. And so it took a very brave person to be a flag bearer. Anybody know why? Did you be what? That's right. You had to be up in the front. And because you're in the front and you're holding up this big, bright flag, you would be a target for the enemy. And they would purposely aim for you, the one holding up the flag. You know, you're holding up the character and the pride of the regiment. So what quicker way than what quicker way to discourage everybody else in the regiment by taking you down first? And of course, this flag was also used for communication purposes. So if you can't hear because there's so much of the cannon fire, the musket fire, you know to follow the flag. But if that flag is taken down, then even the communication among the rest of the regiment is broken down. So they will purposely aim for you. Then, of course, because you're holding the flag, what can't you hold? Your musket, that's right, so you can't even defend yourself. So it took a very brave person to be a flag bearer. And in this battle of Port Hudson, well, at the beginning of every single battle, they would say, if this man should fall, who would be brave enough to drop their weapon and hold the flag bearer? Another brave man would say, I'll do it. But in this battle of Port Hudson, almost immediately the flag bearer was shot and fell. Then another man dropped his gun, grabbed the flag, lifted it back up in the air, and then he was shot and fell. Then another man dropped his gun, grabbed the flag, lifted it back up in the air, and then he was shot and fell. And then two men dropped their guns. They fought over who was going to hold the flag until one of them was shot and fell. Then another one, the man was shot. 6 times the flag went down and it went right back up in the air. And these reporters wrote down how these men refused to let their flag go down. And there were other battles. Shortly after that battle was the Battle of Milton's Bend. And in the Battle of Milton's Bend, there were men who were just slaves, who had just recently been freed. And they were only in training for about a couple of weeks. One of the companies had only received their guns 4 days before the enemy would attack. And you see, because this was a regiment, or this fort was just full of regiments who were former slaves, the enemy just thought, oh, well, this should be easy pickings. These men ain't had enough time to be soldiers. So, their plan was to attack them in the middle of the night, 2 a.m., and by 6 a.m., they had hoped to win the fort. And so when they attacked at 2 a.m., of course, these soldiers, they had just got their guns, they really weren't fully trained, so their skirmishers were not able to really hold them back. So almost immediately, this battle went into hand-to-hand combat. Generally, going to hand-to-hand combat, soldiers fix their bayonets like this. Now, mine is a little loose, but this is, of course, used to stab the enemy. Now, most of the time, soldiers really didn't like using bayonets. as you can imagine how bloody and messy that might be, sticking it into somebody and pulling it back out. And because, you know, they like to use these as a tool and to cook things over, like their coffee over the fire and such. You know, so they like to use this from time to time. And so if you use it in battle, that means you're going to have to clean and scrub all those blood and guts off of it. So most of the time, soldiers really didn't like using their bayonets. And when they went into hand-to-hand combat, most of the time these soldiers would turn around their weapon like this and knock out the enemy with the butt of their weapon. But there were some battles in which the bayonet was used extensively. And this was one of those battles. And these men, these former slaves, they were able to hold off the enemy, fighting hand to hand until 12 noon the next day, where a federal ship called the Choctaw came around again, fired into the battle, and then fired at the retreating Confederates. Shortly after that, the 54th Massachusetts got a chance to prove themselves in battle as they stormed Fort Wagner. And in their storming of Fort Wagner, they were chosen to lead the charge. And it was already known that whatever regiment would lead this charge, because it wasn't expected of them to take the fort. Their job was to distract the enemy long enough so that reinforcements would come in, and then hopefully all of them could take the fort. So the casualties of the leading regiment would definitely be large. These men wanted to prove to the world that they were willing to give their lives for freedom. And after they distinguished themselves in the Battle of Fort Wagner, we were just flabbergasted here in Ohio. I had friends who were fighting, and we couldn't. There was a man called Powhatan Beatty in Cincinnati where I lived at, and he grabbed a group of us, and we came all the way up to Columbus, Ohio, and we went to the governor and said, listen, we got a group of soldiers, send us out to Massachusetts. And they sent word to Massachusetts that they had men here in Ohio ready to join, and Massachusetts sent word back that all their regiments were full, and they weren't receiving any more soldiers. And so the governor sent word to the War Department, saying, hey, we got a group of men here in Ohio who are ready and willing to fight. And the Massachusetts regiments are full. Can we raise a regiment here in Ohio? And the War Department sent word back, yes, you can raise a regiment here in Ohio. And so the 127th Ohio Volunteer Infantry was mustered out of Delaware, Ohio. We would eventually become known as the 5th USCT. And yes, we would get a chance to distinguish ourselves as well. In a battle at a particular place called Chapin's Farm, a battle in New Market House, there was a particular engagement in which we had to attack the enemy, who was a number of yards away. But before we could get to the enemy, there was a number of embankments where there was a battis set up. And I don't know if you know what a battis is. That's where you got branches and trees that you'll cut and sharpen, and you point towards the enemy. So in order for them to get to their destination, they got to cut through this battis, and they got all these pointed pieces at them. So it really slows them down significantly. And so the enemy, we would have to get to the abattis, break through there, and get through the next embankment until we could actually get to the fort. And the enemy had these sharpshooters around where we were attacking. So, the sharpshooters could just kind of slowly pick us off one by one. And when we marched and when we ran and we made it to the first embankment, all of the white officers had either been shot, wounded, or killed. And so it would seem that we had no one to lead us. We had leaders in our ranks. So men like Powhatan Beatty and Milton Holland and Robert Penn and James Bronson took charge of their companies, rallying everybody together, and then cut through their battles, ran us over to the next embankment, cut through that battles, ran us over to the next one, and then cut through that, then ran over to the enemy, and when we came up to the enemy, they ran away. General Butler, he recommended that those men who took charge of their regiments receive the Medal of Honor. And I believe that they received that Medal of Honor. He also recommended a couple of them he recommended them for a promotion. Now, in order to, it's against the policy of the Army to allow black soldiers or black men to become a commissioned officer. So I'm not sure if that's going to go through. But we distinguish ourselves Now this war is starting to come down to an end. We're really putting a pound on the South. But I am here because the war is not quite over with yet. I believe what we're doing and what you've heard that we've been doing is going to bring an end to slavery. It's going to bring a new era of freedom. But since the Confederacy continues to fester on, if there's any among you who are of fighting age, many of you have the ability to please in this, because we need your help. And there'll be a young man who come after me, and I'm sure he'll be willing to give a little bit of summary of what we're going to do, and then later on you can ask him questions. But I thank you for your attention. To wrap up real quick here. The Civil War ended in 1865, and after the end of the Civil War, Congress issued the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery. And shortly after that, in special recognition, which gave full citizenship rights to every person born in this country, no matter your race. Born in this country. By the books, you are supposed to have full citizenship rights. Fight this right for years to come. But now in the books, they are worthy. They shortly after that, they issued the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to every single man. Every single man. So every single thing that these men fought for, they were able to achieve. They were able to fight and win for freedom of those 4 million slaves living in the South. They were able to prove to the world that they deserved full citizenship rights and gained it in the Constitution. And they were able to prove to everyone that they were just as equal as all of those other men who were fighting in this war. Now, I know you probably have many questions, so I will return at the end with the rest of the unit that's here today to answer any questions that you have. So write it down, place it in a little corner in your memory, place it there, and I'll be back. Thank you.